Now, just before I talk about Festus, the new governor, let me just say one additional word about Felix, the former governor. Remember that he was recalled because he incited riots and just didn't really promote peace in Jerusalem. And the Jews had sent letters to Rome complaining about him, and they finally withdrew him. And but he had a brother, as I said in the previous lecture, who had also been a slave, and they were both freedmen. His brother's name was Pallas, Pallus, and he was a personal friend of Nero, the emperor, at the time. And so when Felix was recalled and had to give an account in Rome for his actions in Jerusalem or Caesarea, Pallas went to bat for him, and because of that, he was treated much more leniently than he may have been otherwise. And so just that little historical addition that comes from secular research. But now we have a new governor, Festus. And Festus, in contrast to Felix, was considered to be very amicable. He was cool headed, he was a good negotiator, he really tried to work hard to get along with the people. I mean, let's face it, the Romans realized that the Jews hate them, the Jews want nothing to do with them. The Zealots and the Sicarii, those terrorists, they'll do anything to kill and eliminate the Roman influence and anybody that sides with them. But even so, Festus worked really hard to make it as amicable as possible. And so when he came to the province, he only spent 3 days uh, in Caesarea, and then he went up to Jerusalem. He realized the importance of going to the religious capital there, Jerusalem, capital of Israel, and trying to meet with the leaders there and to make some headway. Okay, so again, Caesarea is the political capital, recognized by Rome of the entire region there, but Jerusalem obviously is the religious capital, and that's where Festus heads after just 3 days in Caesarea. And so what happens? Well, he meets with the high priest and the chief men of the Jews. Whether he met with the entire Sanhedrin, I don't know, but it didn't take them long to inform Festus against Paul. Now, understand that that would not be the only reason for Festus going to Jerusalem. Obviously, there would be lots of things to talk about related to the Jewish Roman relationship, but this is one that comes up. And of course, Luke, because the purpose for his book, mentions this one. They petitioned Festus, asking a favor against him that he would summon him to Jerusalem while they lay in ambush along the road to kill him. So, what's happening here? Paul is still detained in Caesarea. The Jewish leaders say to Festus, would you please send word back to Caesarea and ask the military there to bring him to Jerusalem so that we can have an interview with him. But all along, they're preparing an ambush. Now, this is not new. Remember that the terrorists had tried an ambush. 40 men and more had tried to set an ambush before. It didn't work. And Festus is no dummy. He has been prepped for this new responsibility as governor. He's talked to important people. He probably talked to Felix to get some information. So, he's not in the dark here. And so Festus answers very wisely. He said, no, Paul actually needs to be kept at Caesarea, and I'm going to be going back there shortly. So let's do this. Let those who have authority among you go down with me and accuse this man to see if there's any fault in him. And Felix understands that if they try to bring Paul to Jerusalem, that it's just going to be a mess. And so he says, you guys go with me. You'll still have an opportunity to face him, to accuse him before us. And I think that that'll be a much more orderly way of handling this. So you see, he's very diplomatic. And that's what they did. And so he stayed there more than 10 days in Jerusalem because, as I said earlier, there were lots of things that he would want to talk to the Jews about. And so he went down to Caesarea, and the next day he is sitting on the judgment seat, and that's that word bema, the Greek word that refers to the judgment seat of Christ. It's the same word that's used of the judgment seat of Gallio in Corinth when the Jews tried to bring accusations against Paul there. And he commands Paul to be brought out. And so when Paul had come, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem with Festus stood about and laid many serious complaints against Paul, but same problem, deja vu. They can't prove them. The Roman law really worked well. I mean, Rome was a corrupt system. There were lots of problems with the Roman Empire, lots of immorality, lots of things that were bad. But the Roman law was really a pretty good and well functioning system, pretty fair as legal systems went. And so if you could not prove accusations, then don't expect people just to act on your behalf, out of a bribe or some other motive. And Paul had opportunity to answer for himself. And he said, look, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all. And so the law and the temple obviously refer to the Jewish life, Caesar, the Roman world. And so he says, neither against the Jewish world nor the Roman world have I done anything that they can prove. I have not offended. But Festus still wants to do the Jews a favor. Remember, he's a brand new governor and he wants to get off on the right foot. And so here's what he says to Paul. He looks at Paul in the presence of these Jews who are there visiting. He says, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and there be judged before me concerning these things? Now, just pause with me for a moment. Let's do a little speculation, okay? I'm not going to say anything here that is stated specifically in Scripture, but I'm going to give you an opinion of mine regarding this offer. I personally tend to think that Festus knew ahead of time the answer that Paul would give him. Maybe not. It's just an assumption that I'm making. And if Festus did know what Paul was going to say in response, it actually ends up serving to the advantage of the governor Festus in the long run. And so let me just explain here as this unfolds why I hold that position. Again, it's not stated in Scripture. It's only an opinion that I'm offering to you. It says, Paul, are you willing to go to Jerusalem with me and meet before the Sanhedrin, be judged there? And so Paul said, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews, I've done no wrong, as you very well know. Now, what does he mean by Caesar's judgment seat? Well, Caesar, of course, was actually in Rome, and there was a judgment seat in Rome. But all around the empire, in capital cities, there were places like this in Caesarea where the authority of Caesar in Rome was extended. Just think about our Supreme Court, for example, in Washington, D.C., and then all of the district courts that are spread throughout the country. Now, we're not talking here about a court system, but the concept is the same. And so when Paul says, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, what he's saying is, you guys have all of the authority of Rome behind you to act on behalf of Rome and take care of this issue. He says, to the Jews, I've done no wrong, as you very well know. And they did know that. For if I am an offender or have committed anything deserving of death, I don't object to dying. But if there's nothing in these things of which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me from them. I appeal to Caesar. See, Paul really banks on his Roman citizenship and the fidelity of the Roman law. When he says nobody can deliver me, he's actually complimenting, in a sense, the Roman law. Things have to be done decently and in order if anything's going to happen to me. Now, in verse 10 there, at the very end, Paul says, you know very well that I've done no wrong. So if that's the case, then why doesn't Festus simply let him go? Because there weren't any charges that came with proof. Well, the reason is because Festus doesn't want to stir up trouble with the Jews early in his governorship. In fact, at any time during his governorship would he want to do that, you see. And so even though he has every reason from a legal Roman standpoint to release Paul, He wants to be careful not to stir up trouble with the Jews and create conflict for himself in the future. But notice what Paul does. Paul says, I appeal to Caesar. I've been here 2 years, and this is going nowhere fast. So I appeal to Caesar. Now, when he says I appeal to Caesar, now he's talking about Rome. So in verse 10, Caesar's judgment seat is a reference to the authority there in Caesarea to act on behalf of Rome. But in verse 11, when he says I appeal to Caesar, he's talking about Rome. In other words, he's saying, I want to go to Rome. Now, did he have a right as a Roman citizen to appeal to Caesar in Rome? And the answer is yes, he did. Did Festus have an obligation to grant him that request? And the answer is no. Just because Paul appeals to Caesar doesn't mean that Festus is obliged to grant that petition. And so Paul has acted in accordance with his Roman citizenship. I have a right to appeal to Caesar because nothing has moved forward here in Caesarea for 2 years. And Festus now has to make a decision. Do we grant this or not? Now, again, if I'm correct in assuming that Festus already knew what Paul was going to say, then we can also assume that Festus already knows what he's going to do here. Absolutely, positively, yes, we want to grant this because we want to get Paul out of our hair. Excuse me. Paul is a hot potato here. The Jews want him dead, but we can't legally kill him. So let's get him to Rome and be done with this. So what happens? Festus says, he conferred with the council, not the Sanhedrin, but the council of Roman leadership there in Caesarea. And he comes back to the group and he says, you have appealed to Caesar you shall go. Now, why is this an ingenious idea? Because on the one hand, he's telling the Jews, look, we're going to continue dealing with this. It's just that we're going to stand still here. So we're going to send him to Rome, and your case against him will continue to be tried there in Rome. So he's telling the Jews that, we're not just dismissing this. Gives them some satisfaction in this. But at the same time, Festus and the other leaders there all know that once Paul is shipped to Rome, there's going to be nothing left for the Jews in Jerusalem to do. It's going to be completely out of their hands, out of the hands of the Roman leadership in Caesarea. So it's going to be a very, very desirable outcome for Festus and the others. So again, that's kind of why I think that that Festus asked Paul if he wanted to go to Jerusalem, already suspecting that Paul would understand the uselessness of such a trip and just say, look, I'm going to appeal to Caesar. All right. So you can come to your own conclusions about that, but that's kind of where I am on that. So again, understand who the Roman emperor is at this point. Augustus, of course, the first actual emperor of Rome, and then Tiberius at the time of Jesus' death was the emperor. Then you had Caligula, and you had Claudius, who was emperor most of the time that we're in the book of Acts. But now Nero, having started in 54, is the emperor to whom Paul will eventually appear. And we'll come back and talk about what happens subsequently in the next lecture.